The prime ministers of South Korea and Japan met in Tokyo last week on the sidelines of Japanese Emperor Naruhito's enthronement ceremony. The two agreed on the need to make efforts to mend sour Seoul-Tokyo relations, but the talks did little to bring out tangible outcomes in easing bilateral ties. And today, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga denied reports that the two nations are working under wraps to resolve the compensation issue of Japan's wartime forced labor of Korean nationals. We now take a deeper look at the prospects of South Korea-Japan relations with Dr. Won-gon, Professor of International Studies at Handong Global University. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me here.
So Japan's Kyodo News Agency has reported that the South Korean and Japanese government are now discussing ways to resolve the longstanding issue of wartime forced labor compensation, and that creating a joint fund is being raised as one possible option. Now, both governments have denied the reports, but how do you see the possibility of this option?
Well, I think this is one of the very interesting options so far, because you just mentioned that the South Korean government and South Korean company will set up some kind of a fund and invite Japanese company voluntarily. But the important thing is this is not the fund for compensation for the wartime forced labor. Rather, this is fund for economic cooperation. This is the one of ways to escape of this very sophisticated, delicate issue of the wartime labor, especially our government, our Supreme Court decision of October last year. So this is kind of, I can say, one of the out of the box type of these options. But you just mentioned that both South Korean government and Japanese government, reject and deny this option. But as I mentioned that, if we kind of accept this kind of option, first, South Korean government can escape this kind of accusation that we should respect the Supreme Court decision. But if we accept this option, we still respect the Supreme Court decision, but we compensate in another way. So that is one of the ways to not to get the trouble of the Supreme Court, not to violate, contradict the Supreme Court decision. On the other hand, the Japanese government can also maintain the very strict position that all the compensation measures have settled in 1965 treaty. So if they accept this kind of one, they do not compensate the victims. Rather, this is a fund for economic cooperation. So indirect way compensate the victims, but not the compensation at all. So this is kind of a way to get out from this kind of a deadlock between these two governments. But unfortunately, both South Korean government and Japanese government have rejected this kind of option and idea.
Now, you have briefly mentioned about this, but could you elaborate on this point a bit more? Would the South Korean government accept the idea of creating a joint fund? You've mentioned that it would be a carefully calculated and smart strategy to induce some kind of a progress in the current deadlock. But some claim that it would mean, creating the joint fund would mean that South Korea agrees that all issues, compensation issues, are settled with the 1965 accord.
Yes, exactly. So that's why our government kind of reject this, the idea or option. Because if we accept that one, that means we kind of, although it's indirect way, but kind of intervene the Supreme Court decision. Because South Korean government and South Korean companies compensation the forced labor victims. So our government and South Korean foreign minister mentioned that they even deny that we haven't talked about this idea and option at all, and also said that, quote, while respecting judicial judgment, the South Korean government is open to finding reasonable ways that can be accepted by victims and the people of both countries and countries to communicate with the Japanese diplomatic authority, end quote, which means that it's, moderate way to deny it, but still our government has a very clear position that we respect the Supreme Court decision. Well, it is understandable that because South Korea and even Japan, we are the liberal democratic country, which means that we have to respect the so-called separation of power. the executive could not intervene the decision by the judiciary branch. Supreme Court decided that. We respect that. So that's one of the ways. It's very difficult, the kind of things that we cannot come up with any kind of effective kind of way to resolve this issue.
Now, reports suggest that options other than creating a joint fund are also being reviewed by Seoul and Tokyo, although the two governments keep denying those reports. What other options could there be?
Well, there are several of them. Already, South Korea government officially suggests this option, so-called 1+1, which means that South Korean and Japanese government raised the fund to compensate the victim of the forced labor. But Japanese government instantly rejected this option, this kind of offer by South Korean government. They said that the Japanese government and Japanese companies should not get involved in any kind of compensation. We already keep saying that Japanese government position is to settle all this compensation issue by the 1965 treaty. And second one is so-called 1+1+alpha. That is South Korean company, Japanese company, and also some limited rule by South Korean government. But we are not sure exactly how the South Korean government has played in this kind of options. But our government officials, especially Korean ambassador to Japan, the Nam Gan-pyo mentioned that, quote, South Korea is looking for a solution without state involvement, but if Japan offers any good suggestions, they will be discussed. So this is one of the options. We played, South Korean government played a limited rule, but directly involved the compensation process. And third option is ICJ, International Court of Justice. Yeah, before the July that Japan has get started to retaliate to South Korea, Japan mentioned that they are going to bring this issue to International Court of Justice, and South Korea will totally reject and deny this idea. But nowadays, even some South Korean scholars and even some South Korean government officials mentioned that it can be one of the ways to bring this issue to International Court of Justice. But problem is that if we decide to bring this issue to ICJ, it takes at least 3 years. But all the victims are there late 90s. That they could not wait for 3 more years. And final option is that some people mentioned that South Korea, we do not want to any compensation by Japanese companies. Rather, we wanted to have a very sincere apology by Japanese government. That's it. And we, South Korean government or the South Korean company will compensate the victims of the forced labor. Though that's the final option.
Do the reports signal that Japan is willing to make more efforts to resolve this issue of wartime forced labor compensation? How do you see those reports? Are they a positive sign?
Well, yes, I think it's a positive sign, especially our Prime Minister Lee Nak-hyun, and you just mentioned that he visited Japan the last week. And after he met the Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, and he announced that South Korea and Japan will have an official dialogue. This is one of the good signs, because I know that South Korea and Japan, we have some kind of lots of dialogue and talk. Even South Korean government sent some special envoy to Japanese government, but it's not the public way. But we like to formalize this kind of dialogue talk between these two countries and keep talking with this very sensitive. That's a very, very good sign. And even Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga, and he said that, good quote, there is a mood that South Korea is seeking some sort of talks as they believe it is not good to leave the current situation as it is, end quote. Which means that even Japan, they wanted to seek some kind of exit strategy. We all know that this is not a win-win game at all. It's a lose-lose game. Both if this kind of a dispute has prolonged, between the South Korea and Japan, both of countries can hurt. So that's why it is time to seek some kind of exit strategy, but it's very difficult. But it's kind of good sign that both South Korea and Japan, we want to talk. We want to come up with some kind of a solution.
The Japanese government, however, at least on the surface, is not budging an inch from its original stance, renewing calls in South Korea to take action about the Supreme Court ruling. It appears not much has changed after Prime Minister Lee Na-kyun's visit, although an official dialogue has been mentioned. What is Japan aiming for?
Yes, you are right. The Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga and told that he kind of reiterate the exact same position. The Japan's position that issue was settled under the 1965 bilateral pact, the period. They do not have any intention to back up this position. So that means the Japanese company, they are not going to pay any kind of compensation for this forced labor. So that's why we are talking about this kind of new options, new way, this kind of outside the box way to deal with this issue. But at this very moment, both South Korea government and Japanese government can totally reject this idea.
Korea's military intel sharing pact with Japan will be officially terminated on November 22nd. And now this date is seen by many as some kind of a deadline to resolve Seoul-Tokyo issues. Would we be able to see some kind of a progress before that date?
Well, for South Korea, we should. I mean, this is GSOMIA, the Military Information Exchange Pact between Japan and South Korea. It's not the kind of important thing between Japan and South Korea. Rather, this is kind of relationship, very closely related to the relationship between South Korea and United States. We all know that how we finalized and established this GSOMIA, because at that time, the United States has strongly urged both Japan and South Korean government to come up with some kind of agreement of the GSOMIA. So that's why when our South Korean government decided to pull out this GSOMIA deal last August, the United States government, U.S. Department of Defense, and U.S. Department of State very strongly urge and kind of criticize South Korean government. So that's why I'm a little bit worried about this November 22nd. We don't have enough time, but in order to we have this, pull out withdraw our decision to pull out from this GSOMIA. We have to have some kind of at least roadmap to how to deal with this very sensitive issue with Japan. That is including the forced labor issue and also Japanese economic retaliation. But problem is we don't have enough time at this moment.
President Moon Jae-in has sent a letter to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, prompting speculations that Seoul-Tokyo talks would follow. How do you gauge the possibility of the two leaders meeting face-to-face during the APEC summit set for next month?
Well, I think it is important to have a summit between South Korea and Japan because we already talk lots of issues. I introduced at least 4 or 5 different ideas. As far as I know, both government officials, not publicly, but talk about these ideas and share this information. But still, the official position of both South Korean government and Japanese government deny and reject all these options. So that means it is time to decide by the leaders of both countries. But problem is, if they wanted to meet, at least they reach some kind of a interim agreement or a very rough version of a roadmap to how to resolve this one. But still, we are far away from this kind of interim agreement. So we have to do our best, especially before this end of the GSOMIA. South Korea government is more actively participate and discuss this issue with Japan.
Well, it appears, like you've mentioned, we don't have much time left, though. As a diplomacy expert, what more should be done to ease tensions between the two neighboring countries at this point?
Well, wartime forced labor issue is the most important one. Although we have 3 important issues between South Korea and Japan, that is including GSOMIA and also the Japanese economic retaliation. But if we have come up with some kind of resolution about this wartime forced labor issue, then we can come up with the solution with 2 other issues. So we need to focus and concentrate on that. We talk about these options. That is one of the good start. We can, have some kind of advanced, options based on this the idea that we just mentioned.
Thank you, Dr. Park, as always, for your insights.
Thank you.